The early morning sun was shining brightly between the clouds and beaming through the window into the tram. Lance positioned his foreleg so the sun wouldn't shine into Cherry's face, wanting her to sleep as long as she could. Lance hadn't slept all night. The images of last night kept creeping back into his mind whenever he closed his eyes. Was his father dead? What if he had been home just a minute later? Would Cherry Blossom be lying in a hospital instead of right here with him? Lance didn't want to think about that. He had to be strong. For her.
Ponyville?
The conductor was walking down through the tram, shouting loud enough to wake any passengers who may have fallen asleep.
Ponyville is the next stop?
Cherry Blossom stirred and then looked up at her brother.
Morning, sleepyhead,
Lance said to her with a smile.
How are you feeling?
Cherry said nothing. Instead, she rested her head back down against his foreleg.
She's been through a lot.
Lance thought to himself.
It's a whole new world for her now.
She never got to go far outside at home. Taking the garbage to the bins was the furthest she ever gotten to go. Now she was out in the big wide world with only her brother to protect her. She was scared, but she knew she was safe.
Want to take a look outside? You can see our new home from here.
Curious, Cherry Blossom looked towards the window, then stood up and stepped over her brother to see outside. After letting her eyes adjust to the light, she saw it. Ponyville looked so peaceful. No large buildings, no giant billboards or eyesores obstructing your view, no flashing lights going all day and night. Ponyville was a simple, quiet town. Miles of open fields of grass, beautiful landscapes, unique houses, a farm with thousands of trees, some lakes and even a forest at the far edge. And above it all was a city that looked like it was just hanging off the side of a single mountain, like it was floating just below the clouds. It looked like a princess's palace. Cherry turned towards her big brother, her large hazel eyes alight with wonder.
What's that big palace up there?
She asked with excitement in her voice.
That's Canterlot. That's where all the rich, fancy ponies live. It's also home to the princesses.
You mean Luna and Celestia?
Cherry's smile was getting bigger at the mention of the princesses. Lance smiled back as he corrected her.
Celestia, yes. And remember when I told you that one day I was going to become a royal guard?
Cherry nodded.
Well, this'll make things easier. Ponyville is right in the shadow of Canterlot, so we won't have far to go once I've saved up enough bits. And then we can move to the city. Would you like to live up in that big palace with the princesses?
Cherry smiled and nodded enthusiastically.
Ponyville?
The train conductor was making his way back towards them.
Ponyville is the next stop?
Lance turned back to Cherry Blossom.
Well, this is our stop. You ready?
The smile faded from Cherry Blossom's face. She had her hopes up about going to live in Canterlot and completely forgot that that wasn't where they were going.
Hey, don't worry. We'll get there one day. I just have to get a job and save up. It will take a while, but I promise you'll like our new home in Ponyville.
Cherry raised her head up and then nodded.
And besides, it's just you and me now. Together.
Lance gave her a quick one-legged hug as she smiled back up at him. They then jumped down from their seats, ready to see their new home. The train slowly came to a stop. The other few passengers began making their way off, but by the looks of it, no other ponies were coming on. With how early it wasn't too surprising. They were lucky they could even get a train that late to take them to Ponyville. They stepped off the train and away from the station. The sun shined down on the both of them with the clouds mostly cleared, making for what will surely be a beautiful day with a deep blue sky. Although the grass was still wet beneath their hooves, and the wind had an early morning chill to it that made Lance wish he'd packed something warm for the both of them to wear. He looked down at Cherry Blossom and saw her shivering. Lance knelt down next to her, low enough for her to climb on his back.
Come on. Let's find our new home.
Lance smiled at her as she quickly jumped onto his back, then they took off at a quick trot. Every house in Ponyville was bright and colourful. Some houses were even designed to look like sweets. All except this one. This house had walls of dark grey stone, a green door with paint peeling from it, dirty windows on either side of the door, and overgrown vines crawling up the walls to the roof. The roof itself was in serious disrepair. Faded red tiles were missing, the chimney was cracked and beyond use. Lance Angelswift, with Cherry Blossom at his side, looked at the house in silence. This was their mother's house growing up, but after she had inherited it from her parents, she was never able to sell it when she moved to Las Pegasus. The house was on private land, close to the Everfree Forest, yet so far away from Ponyville itself that no other home could be seen. Only one path led to this house, and it was a small, overgrown dirt path that had weeds all the way down it.
Let's take a look inside.
Lance hadn't expected the house to be left to rot over the years. Surely some pony would have helped to keep it in repair, beautify the landscape. Lance walked to the house. He pushed against the front door and expected it to be locked, but to his surprise it opened. The door creaked loudly and immediately stopped. Something was blocking the door from the other side. Lance looked down and saw what was stopping the door from opening. Letters. Years of letters all piled up, preventing the door from opening further. Lance gave a hard push, and all the letters slid across the hall. Many of them looked surprisingly new, which meant someone was still delivering them.
Well, it looks like we'll have plenty to read.
Lance tried to joke, but then noticed Cherry wasn't standing next to him. He turned around to see she was at the window, looking at a flower bed below it. Lance walked over and saw a row of weeds, the smallest pieces of litter and dead leaves that seemed to have blown over from the forest. But that wasn't what she was looking at. Among the weeds was a single white calla lily, drooping downwards but not touching anything below it. It looked like it was fighting to prevent itself from falling and touching the weeds and the dirt below.
Don't worry, we'll have plenty of time to fix everything up and make it all look like a real home. You'll see.
The little pink filly didn't respond straight away. She just kept looking at the lone flower like it was the most beautiful thing in the world, and it was struggling to survive.
Can we help it?
Cherry asked, finally looking up at her brother. Lance gave her a smile back.
Of course we can.
He looked around, seeing if there was a watering can or anything like that nearby. Lance told Cherry to wait there while he went around the house. There wasn't much to find. No tool shed or anything like that. Just a large open space full of weeds that stretched all the way to the forest edge 100 yards away. No, there was something else. Near the forest edge was exactly what he was looking for. Lying on its side was a small metal watering can. Lance went over to it and leaned down to pick it up in his mouth. It was quite rusty from the look of it, but the handle looked safe enough to pick up. Biting down on the handle, he lifted it up and turned towards the house. But something pulled on it. Vines had grown around the spout and were tightly wrapped around it, going into the ground beneath the long grass and leading into the forest. Lance pulled hard on the watering can and the vines pulled tight. Lance pulled again, harder, and then eventually the vines tore off. He stumbled a step, just managing to keep his balance, and then he heard a moaning sound coming from inside the forest. Lance stared to where he thought he heard the noise coming from. Surely it was just his mind playing tricks on him. The forest didn't just moan in pain, did it? Lance took a step away from the forest, unsure of exactly what he had heard. The forest seemed to grow colder as he stared into it. He then became aware that he couldn't look away, transfixed on the darkness between the trees. Lance could feel chills down his spine as the forest somehow seemed to move closer to him.
Is something wrong?
Lance yelped, jumping right out of his skin and dropping the watering can. Cherry had been wondering what took her big brother so long and came to check on him, accidentally sneaking up on the young stallion in the process. Lance caught his breath, then turned to her.
No, nothing's wrong, just...
Lance turned back to the forest once more. Everything seemed perfectly normal now.
What? What is it?
Cherry started to sound nervous. Lance turned back to her, and then laughed at himself.
It's nothing. Your big brother's just a little tired, that's all.
He kneeled down and then picked up the watering can in his mouth. Lance headed over to the front door and went inside. The house wasn't in the best shape. Dust had settled on every surface, mould and mildew spread out from the windows, cobwebs covered every corner and hung between every open doorway. On the bright side, the house still had running water. Lance had let Cherry Blossom water the flower in the garden and told her that the other weeds would have to be cleared out soon. She had asked to do it right away, but without the proper tools it would just be a waste of time. They had checked every room in the house, seeing what they could keep and what needed replacing. Food was the top on the priority list. There was no fridge, and the cupboards held nothing but a few long rotten pieces of fruit and a few expired cakes, all of which were now lying at the bottom of a bin outside. Everything in the house was completely covered in dust. There was only one faded blue cushion in the house and a small bed. Other than that, there was nothing else here. While food was a top priority, there was an even bigger problem. Money. Lance had spent all of his bits getting them there, and that may have been a foolish mistake. No money means no food. He wasn't about to let his sister starve. They were both pretty hungry by this point, and it looked like they would have to make do with what they could find. Being ponies, they could eat grass no problem, and there was plenty of it outside, but it looked quite unhealthy. This grass hadn't been trimmed in years, and most of it had been touched by all kinds of wild animals coming out from the forest. The colour of the grass was a bit off too. Instead of a healthy green, it was lighter, almost pale like it was dying. A lot of work was going to be needed to fix up this house. Lance went outside and picked the healthiest looking pieces of grass he could find, quite far off and closer to Ponyville itself. Even just in his teeth the grass felt brittle and stale. He used a watering can to collect the grass in and planned on washing it in the sink once he was back in their house, just to be safe. There were no plates or tables in the house, so Lance cleaned off the side counter for them to eat off of. They ate slowly, Cherry protesting the taste of the grass. But there was nothing Lance could do. This would have to do for at least one day. They spent the rest of the day cleaning up as much of the house as possible. It was a horrible and filthy job, but they kept at it. Lance eventually got to the letters by the front door.
Maybe some of these are for Mother?
Lance thought to himself. There were a lot of letters, but what surprised him wasn't that the letters were addressed to all different ponies, but they were all delivered to the wrong address.
What kind of male pony would make a mistake this bad? Repeatedly!
He scooped up a large number of them, mostly those that hadn't faded over the years, and looked at them. One that grabbed his attention was a bright pink one which was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Cake.
Sugar Cube Corner. I think I saw that while walking through the town.
Lance stared down at a few other ones. Most looked like junk mail, but he saw another pink envelope. This one was addressed to a pony named Miss Cheerily at the Ponyville Elementary School.
An elementary school? That's perfect! I can ask her if Cherry Blossom can enroll there.
Lance had a plan. First, he'd head to Sugar Cube Corner to deliver the letter, ask for directions to the school, and then talk to Miss Cheerily. Looking outside, Lance saw that it was only mid-afternoon. Plenty of the day to go.
Cherry?
Lance called out to his sister.
Yes?
Cherry Blossom came out into the hallway looking filthy, like she had been rolling around in the dust and dirt. Lance had to suppress a laugh, seeing how silly she looked. The pink filly saw her brother trying not to laugh, then tilted her head confused. More dust drifting off her mane. That was it. Lance broke out laughing as she looked even more confused.
What's so funny?
She asked innocently. Lance composed himself as he looked back to his sister, wiping away a tear with a hoof.
We're going out. But first we gotta get you cleaned up.
Cherry looked down at herself and noticed how filthy she was.
Well, you're not exactly Mr. Soaps either.
Lance gave himself a look over. He was just as filthy as she was. Cherry giggled when she saw his face and then poked her tongue out at him.
Oh no, you didn't.
Lance stared her down.
Oh yes, I did.
Cherry responded and stuck out her tongue again. Lance chased her and she ran into the next room. Lance jumped at her, but Cherry screamed and then she moved swiftly out of the way, laughing as she ran for the door again, looking for a place to hide.
You can't escape me.
Lance gave chase again, right into the bedroom. She was clearly hiding under the bed and Lance stopped. He then slowly began walking around the bed.
Come out, wherever you are.
Lance called out in a sing-song voice.
I know you're here.
Lance mock looked in all the silliest places, behind dusty curtains, on the bed itself, but with very few places to actually look, he quickly had to turn his attention to where he knew she already was.
I know where you are. You're right here!
Lance shouted as he dropped to his belly and was face to face with her under the bed. She screamed and turned to crawl out the other side, but he grabbed her by the tail and dragged her out. She was screaming between fits of giggles as he began tickling her.
Stop! Stop!
She cried out between breaths and screams, tears forming in her eyes.
Do you give up?
Lance kept tickling her as she rolled and squirmed on the dusty floor.
Yes, I give up! I give up!
Cherry stopped screaming as he stopped the onslaught of tickling. but she continued to laugh afterwards nonetheless. Lance pulled her up and held her in a tight hug. They both stayed there for about a minute holding each other and catching their breath.
Come on. We need to get cleaned up.
Lance set Cherry Blossom down. She still had tears in her eyes, but they were the kind that wouldn't break her heart, but rather melt it. They had both been through a lot in the last 24 hours. Their father, the long trip leaving them with no money, a practically empty house on the edge of a creepy forest. But as long as they had each other, they knew everything would be alright.